It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Marc Gruber. I'm editor-in-chief of the Academy of Management Journal, and I'm joined by my wonderful colleagues and now friends, Dorobantu from NYU, Davide Ravasi from University College London, and Wellman from Arizona State University. We have authored from the editor's piece called the AMJ Management Research Canvas, a tool for conducting and reporting empirical research. You see it here with my highlights. This one is freely available on the AMJ website. We will share it here on the chat as well, so you don't have to look for it, together with the worksheet and the table. Since Davide, Ned, and many of the other team members actually engaged in a lot of paper development workshops over the last 2-3 years. And we made a recurring observation. And the observation was that scholars with a little bit of more systematic approach towards the research endeavor, towards the writing of the paper, ultimately would have avoided a lot of issues, problems with their studies. So after a while, we compiled a set of questions and had the idea to put together a tool that is very practical. It's the AMJ Management Research Canvas. I will show it to you later on in a more sophisticated manner by sharing my screen. But this is a canvas that can be printed, that can be put on a poster. That's the basic idea, so that you can map out your research projects as they progress, and that you have within 9 main cells, and we walk you through the 9 main cells as well later on, so that you have a clear map of what a research paper should entail and a high-end research project should entail. Together with this canvas, there is a AMJ Management Research Canvas worksheet that dives into each of those cells and poses several questions that are pertinent to addressing the issues highlighted by each of these cells. For instance, the cell is about the puzzle, that is the core of the canvas. And there we have a couple of questions that actually help you to understand what we mean with a puzzle and how you should think about addressing a puzzle. So when we discuss the canvas later on, we will refer to the main canvas, but also point to the different questions that are available to you. In short, what we want to have is a tool that helps you to think through your research projects, conduct them, and write them up in a compelling manner. We did not want to create like a uniform blueprint, that you should put over each and every research project. That was not the idea, It's more like a canvas that should stimulate your thinking about what are the topics, what are the core issues that you should address. And we are well aware that the different epistemological, ontological traditions would emphasize one or the other element more, which is completely fine. The tool is there, and it's up to you to apply it in the way you prefer applying it, and what we have seen so far is that many PhD students, younger scholars, but also more advanced scholars use it, for discussing their research projects in teams, discussing the research project with their supervisors, presenting the research project in research seminars. So it's really a universal tool that you can apply and use in many occasions. So with this said, let me briefly share the canvas and walk you and give you an overview, and also introduce how we will run the remainder of this session. So we have, let me share my screen here for you. Here we go. You should see the canvas now. The canvas is really done in a way that you can write in there, put post-its note on it, so that or pencil in your thoughts, so that this becomes a living document. It has these 9 main cells: the puzzle, the audience in prior research, the research question, the theoretical constructs and relationships, the research setting, the research design and analysis, the empirical findings, the contributions, and the boundary conditions and limitations. And as I explained it, you realize that we put this on here in the direction of a clock. So you basically start in the middle, but then you can basically use the white background highlighted cells as a next step, the lighter gray shaded cells, and then the darker gray shaded cell, in that logic. Of course, you're going to revisit one or the other cell as you think through your project, as you conduct your project. So it's not a linear sequence, but that's the way how we portray it, and that usually helps scholars to think systematically through your canvas and through your research project. What we're gonna do is to explain to you each of those cells, and my co-authors, Sinzi, Davide and Ned will walk you through 3 of these cells each. So Cinzi will cover the puzzle, the boundary, the audience and prior research going up to the left, and the research question. After that, we do a brief break and we take your questions regarding those 3 cells. Okay, if you have questions about the other cells, please wait for when we discuss those. Then Davide will take over. He will discuss the next 3 cells, the theoretical constructs and relationships, the research setting, research design and analysis, and then Ned takes over and will discuss the empirical findings, contribution, boundary conditions, and limitations. The scholars who are here today are really very broadly based in terms of methods and approaches in terms of content. Cinzi and I are more macro researchers. Ned is a micro researcher, OB researcher, and Davide is a qualitative researcher. And when we designed the canvas, we wanted to have all these different perspectives embedded in the canvas. So it's really a tool that can be used across the different disciplines, across the different methodological approaches. And as we explain the different cells of the canvas, we will highlight those differences that might exist within a certain cell. Yeah? So with this said, I want to wish you a wonderful session. We will take the questions, as I said, after each of these 3 blocks of discussion, and the end have a general Q&A. So if your question has more the touch and feel of a general question, may I kindly ask you to ask that in the very end. We will take our time to respond to your questions. Okay, with this said, thank you very much for joining. I see that we have close to 250 live listeners. This is fantastic. This is exciting. And I want to turn over to Cinzi. Cinzi is based in New York. I'm based in Lausanne. So like you, we are spread across the globe, which that makes this even more exciting. So Cinzi, I'm going to share my canvas with you in a second, but maybe first we're going to see you in full. Here she is.
Thank you so much, Marc. And good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to all of you, depending on where you are on the globe right now. I wanna build a little bit on what Marc just said, just to emphasize a couple of points about the big picture, and then I'm gonna focus and kind of use that big picture to zoom in on 3 of the elements, just as Marc suggested. So, the most important thing, I'd love for you to just take this sort of big picture, look at the canvas as a puzzle with 9 different parts or 9 different pieces, and kind of keep in mind that analogy to a picture puzzle that you might put together with, with a family member or by yourself if you're sort of enjoy doing that. Obviously, you might be doing a 500 piece puzzle or a 1,000 piece puzzle, or maybe even more ambitious than that. For us, it's just 9 pieces because we, in multiple conversations that we had about this, we kind of zoomed in on the fact that there are sort of 9 core elements of a well-defined and well-developed research project in the management field. These are common to all the different publications or most publications that you see in top journals. And we designed this visual image that looks like a puzzle and like a canvas, of course, to reflect just that. And then to what Marc was saying before, the other thing to notice about this is just like a puzzle, right? It doesn't, a final manuscript will have a very clear linear progression in it, but the development of a project is not that, right? Just as a puzzle, like a physical picture puzzle, you might start in one part of the puzzle and then kind of go around, or you might start at the edges and then go towards the middle, or start in the middle and go towards the edges, right? The picture puzzle doesn't necessarily force a linear progression. A manuscript does, but the putting together of a picture puzzle doesn't force that. And we actually think that's also a very nice analogy of how we develop our research projects. Some people might start with a very, very clear research question from day one. Some will perhaps think more about the data and the empirical setting first before they really narrow down their research questions. Some people, depending on the research team, they might iterate in different ways. Qualitative research is different than quantitative research, and so on and so forth, right? So there are many, many different ways to kind of get to this, to put together a full puzzle, but the final product has these core elements in it, no matter how we get there, right? So the next thing that I want you to notice about a puzzle is that in the very sort of the central piece of that, of our visual, is really the puzzle. And here we mean something else, right? Here we mean the research puzzle. So what's that sort of the puzzle? You see under it the question, you know, what broad management question does this research project address, right? You can see that as Marc is zooming in, right? So this is the very broad management research question that a research project is trying to address. You know, things as big as how do companies innovate? How do people in organizations work together and collaborate? What are the impacts of, you know, sustainability efforts, firm level sustainability efforts on firm performance and society? These are very big, important puzzles in management research with very large communities of scholars seeking to provide parts of the answers to these broad questions. But because they're very, very broad questions, not one single research project can provide a full answer, right? We get fuller and fuller answers, if you will. We kind of get to understanding these broad research puzzles by adding more and more research to kind of the big picture. Each new research article or each new research study provides a partial but incomplete answer. Together, different research articles will contribute to us getting a better and better understanding of these broad, very broad management topics, right? So essentially, think about it as, you know, think about this big puzzle, this broad management question, as the reason why you're doing the research in the first place, knowing very, very well that with one particular study, one single study, we're not going to find we're not going to get the full answer. So this puzzle in the middle of it all, it connects to all the different pieces, but it's also much bigger than one single study and therefore much bigger than a research question. I think this is a very important point to understand, especially when we frame our studies and we're motivating them, when we're trying to explain to others, right? Because this is what all of, you know, what a community of the puzzle is, what a community of scholars is interested in, whereas a study will only focus on something much more narrow than that, right? So I'm going to move to I'm going to move to the research question next, because I think it's important to connect these two, right? So on top of this puzzle piece that sits in the middle of the canvas is the research question part. And this is, you know, intentionally much more narrower, and a lot more specific, right? So here the questions the sort of very broad questions that should guide you to when you define this is, what specific question does your research address? Why is it important to answer this question? Obviously, it's related to the puzzle, so that's really important. So this relationship between the puzzle and the research question, I think it's something that we need to understand very, very well as we define and develop our research. The puzzle is broad, the research question is specific and narrow. It has to be so specific and so narrow that it can be answered fully in the scope of one study, and the author should be able to provide a very persuasive answer to it, right? So whereas the puzzle, you know, the puzzle cannot be answered by a single research question, by a single research study, the research question should be answered in a single research article. Or another way of saying that, you know, the research question should be phrased in such a way, or essentially designed in such a way to allow the authors to answer it compellingly in one research study. So if you look at the worksheet that we put together, right, you can see the same thing in the worksheet, that when we talk about the puzzle, the questions are very, very broad, right? What broad management question does this research project address? What are you trying to explain or better understand? Why is this puzzle important? If it's a phenomenon or a theoretical perspective. But then once we move to the audience and to the research question itself, which is kind of, we're skipping here the audience and prior research, and I'll get to it next. The questions become very, very specific, right? What specific question does your research address? How can you succinctly state the research question to focus on one aspect of the broader puzzle? What variables or constructs are implied in the research question? This is what we mean by getting more precise. In some ways, and again, depending on the research, sometimes a little bit less in qualitative research than quantitative research, the key construct or the key variables are already foreshadow in the research question itself? Or how does your research question identify what you're trying to explain, the dependent variable, the process, its outcome? Does it also suggest what might it explain key independent variables? What might explain it, sorry, the key independent variables. And then of course, the next question in the worksheet is, why is it important to research to answer this research question? This is what connects it to the puzzle, right? Again, I'm going to make this statement, perhaps not everybody agrees with me, but not everybody is interested in every single research question out there, but there are communities of scholars interested in the puzzle and the research puzzle itself, and that's what brings us together as groups trying to work on a particular. Okay, so I'll continue. I'll go back to the canvas, Marc, if you don't mind, and kind of come back to this idea of how do we narrow down from the puzzle to a very specific research question. I mean, I think the first thing to mention here is to recognize that it has to be something that's interesting to the authors themselves, right? Something that motivates them to work on that particular research question, to find a good research design and be able to answer it. But beyond that, there are two more things that are really important to recognize that are very helpful to think about and get clarity within the research team. First, and this is what I think every research team does, is to get clarity on the prior research, essentially what other studies have tried to answer either that specific research question or a very similar or related research question within the scope of the broader research puzzle. And then the audience themselves. So let me say about something about the prior research first, right? Which is the literature or the set of articles that address the puzzle and provide a partial answer to this broader puzzle. It tells us what we know about the broad puzzles and implicitly what we don't know about it. It defines, it kind of helps us outline some sort of white spaces in our knowledge that motivate the narrowing down to a specific research question. And then this narrowing down is also critical because it helps, I would argue here that the understanding of prior research has to be at such a deep level that the authors should be able not only to just kind of lay out or map the landscape of prior work that has addressed the same broad puzzle and the foundations, but also to be able to provide a very clear positioning of the current study, of the new study within that landscape, right? To understand, there are very different perspectives that we bring to understanding a broad puzzle, right? Sometimes it's even as broad as different disciplines, and we need to understand where the new study sits on that landscape. And then the other thing to mention, and these two things are very much related, right? This prior research is not just studies on a piece of paper, but they're actually a community of scholars, right? And this is the audience, right? The audience is the group of people who work on the same puzzle and very often very similar research questions, which means they attend the same workshops, conferences as the authors of a particular study. They're the ones who oftentimes provide the best feedback, either informally through a friendly read or perhaps through the blind review process, right? And this is sort of based on my personal experience. At some point when I was asked by a very senior person to name 5 people that I wanted to read some study that I was working on, I realized that I was kind of struggling to come up with the good names, but that experience itself made me kind of approach every single new research project by trying to visualize almost kind of the pictures of the people who I would like the final product that I put out, or maybe a draft of the paper that I'm working on. Who would I want to read that work? All right, I'm going to ask Marc, Davide, and Ned if they want to add anything on these 3 first parts. This we've talked, here, because you see what Marc is zooming into, right? Again, the puzzle is the darker shade in this all because it connects to everything. But then audience, prior research, and research question have a slightly different shading than the rest of the canvas because we think about them as sort of this big part of at the beginning of a paper where we motivate, where we frame a particular manuscript. And these are things that we believe every single research team needs to think about when they try to define and narrow down their work. So Marc, Davide, and Ned, would you like to add anything on this?
I just have one thing, which is I think one of the value adds of this particular tool is that it brings all of these different pieces of the research process together. And so we're talking about these things one at a time, but a really important point is as you're going through your project to make sure that everything's cohesive. So in addition to not having these elements, another problem that we sometimes see with papers is that the elements aren't cohesive. So you set up your research question and then your theory doesn't have anything to do with the research question, or you set up your theory and then the method that you pick is not consistent with the theory. So we're certainly not the first to talk about these elements, but I think the value of bringing them all together is it can help authors as you're thinking about your project, make sure that not only you have all the pieces that you need, but that they fit together. So like the different puzzle pieces need to fit with one another. That would be the only thing I have to add at this stage of the discussion.
If I may add something for a qualitative researcher, I think it's always important that even though the research we do is always case-based, we are studying a particular group of people, a particular organization, an occupation, an industry. We are not really interested in a generalist journal like AMJ in this particular setting per se. We are interested in what happened in this setting or what's happening in this setting because we can generalize what we learn from the study towards a broader, more abstract setting. And this is relevant for the formulation of your research question because your research question should be formulated in theoretical terms, not in empirical terms. And often we see papers that are submitted to AMJ that fail to provide the kind of theoretical contribution that we expect because they formulate the research question in empirical terms in the first place. So they provide us with an explanation of what happened in that particular situation, in that particular case, in that particular setting, but they are unable then to tell us why is this relevant more broadly for a broader type of organizations, industries, or occupations.
Great. So are there any questions regarding those three parts? And I look at particular people who have not had the chance to ask any questions.
Marc, if there's a question in the chat that I think is a really good question to address right now, and it refers to essentially how should we think about novel trends in management theory related to AI, machine learning, virtual reality, and how these might influence the development of new constructs and relationships within a Canvas framework, right? We've had this conversation many times before, right? On sort of in one view of the world, AI, machine learning, virtual reality are very, very new things, new technologies, and perhaps even new phenomena. On another level, they are just technologies, right? So, and we have a ton of research on technological change and how it affects different things, or within organizations, firm innovation, how it affects society, and how it's many different things that we want to think about, right? So I think it's on the authors to figure out how to make that connection, how to connect to prior work that is relevant, and in this particular case, it's work on technological disruption, work on technological research and development or technological adoption, whatever it is that the authors care about. So how to connect to that prior research, but while at the same time figuring out what's new, right? And I think that's it's an important step. It's a huge step. It's sometimes one of the most challenging parts of our work, to figure out, how to be part of a broader conversation while also recognizing that we need to bring something new to the discussion as well.
What I tend to emphasize, and the team tends to emphasize, we're living in these transformational times where lots of new questions arise, and that means there are a lot of interesting new questions that are here, where individuals that could not even be asked a couple of years ago, because the technology has evolved. You have blockchain that allows to organize companies in a novel way. You have online options for remote work nowadays that are very pervasive. So there are lots of new phenomena that have been on the rise that require new types of research to look into and to explain. And sometimes the theories we used to have are no longer applicable or fully applicable to these types of phenomena. So building on what Davide was saying and others, I think it's very critical to understand, what type of existing theories can we use, but what are also the boundary conditions, given that the world has evolved so quickly.
Sorry, Marc, there's another question that we may want to address quickly.
Yes, please.
That says, what if the audience I want to address hasn't written about this particular topic? What if somebody else wrote about this topic rather than my audience? Now, first of all, I think it's important to acknowledge everything that is relevant. Now, if you're studying a particular topic that has been investigated also by anthropologists, economists, labor theorists, historians, they might have called it slightly differently, but if they were interested in essentially the same thing, we need to acknowledge what we know already about this particular phenomenon in the social sciences. Just because somebody might have used a different label or the conversations may not have intersected, it doesn't mean that we don't know anything about it. And the other thing you might want to ask yourself is, if your intended audience has never talked about this, has never written anything about this, why do you want to talk to them? Is this is really a natural audience for your study? Will it really welcome your study the way you intended? Think about it.
Okay. So Maria, you had not had the chance to ask a question. If you can unmute yourself.
Thank you.
Yes.
My question is, I think one of the biggest challenges we have with doctoral students is that most of them come into our programs with empirical questions. And of course, we guide them to look into the literature for them to be able to transform those research questions into more theoretical research questions. But I was wondering if you could give us any practical advice that can help us in that process.
Is this a case
Davide, you unmuted? Yes, Davide.
What is this a case of? Just force them to ask, like, what is this a case of? What is the broader phenomenon that you're trying to understand?
And to top that, right? We've been very transparent so far. So Marc mentioned at the beginning, we started this canvas with the worksheet, really, like with this sort of mindset of putting together a worksheet for the PDWs, for the paper development workshops. So my goal is to have this worksheet and hand it to a PhD student and say, okay, you have this idea in mind. Now answer in 3 or 4 sentences every single question on this. Some of them are going to feel repetitive, of course, but just the exercise of sitting down and saying, okay, this is why I'm doing this. This is why others should be interested in doing that, in reading this. This is how I connect it to, all this, and so on and so forth, right? Because we haven't covered all of it yet. But to me, it's the questions in the worksheet, and then the canvas kind of connects them at the very big picture level.
And I think this is an area where iteration is really important as well, especially working with doctoral students, to just try again. Try again. I think the average introduction of a paper gets written 12 times or 13 times. And with PhD students, my own students, I have to push them, like the first articulation of why their practical question is important theoretically is almost never that great. But then maybe there's a nugget there that you can build on or go read some more papers and try again. So again, working this process in a more cyclical, iterative fashion, as opposed to just assuming the first thing that you put for theory is going to be, or audience is going to be correct, I think is important.
Anna Maria, you had a question.
From what Marc and Davide said, I think to ask if with any evolution theory, the original framework should eventually be proven to be wrong, given how reality changed so fast. But at the same time, it should still provide a framework, a kind of guidance for when we go in to collect data, to know what we are looking for. Because when I go into the field and I collect data, I can see everything, but I still use the very old paper framework like Weber bureaucracy, like the dimensions of organizational structure as a way to form my interview question. All of those framework has been proven to be wrong empirically, but it provides a foundation. And so one of the things that I struggle with the most, and Lisa, like my supervisor, helped me a lot with this, is actually find that foundational literature that helped me before going into the field. And I just want to know whether you, as small seasoned scholar, has any tip or trick when you choose between this large literature.
First, let me say, before even maybe my team members also answer this question, I think what you're doing is exactly right. There's no shortcut to understand the field. You need to go back to the classics. You need to go back to the origins in order to understand also the evolution. And we are just currently all writing up and from the editor piece that is entitled "Re-engaging with the Classics," because we see that too few people actually do this. So Anna Maria, I think you're completely on the right track by looking at the classics, but then you understand also why the papers that build on these classics have defined new boundary conditions, refuted part of that theory that was postulated maybe 100 years ago, 60 years ago. But the opposite can also happen, that there are elements in these classics that have been overlooked. That you have, that there are features that become more relevant nowadays that have not been as much theorized or elaborated on as one could wish for. So it's I think that knowledge of the classics and then of the trajectory, because that goes closer to your question, how has that body of work evolved? There's no shortcut, and that's where we all would agree that ChatGPT can give you probably an answer which is wrong and limited, but it's your intellectual journey to understand that trajectory and your studies during your PhD and later on, and that never ends. If you look at Davide, Cinzi, Ned, and myself, we have been in that profession for quite some time, and this never ends. It's one of the beautiful elements of our profession that we always can read new things and update and understand where the field currently stands, also in perspective of the classics and these foundational theories. Davide, Ned, Cinzi, anything to add? Ned, you're unmuted. You're just like unmuted. Like
No, I just forgot to mute myself again. I don't have anything else at the moment.
Okay. Victor, we take one more question and we need to move on. Looking at a bit of the time. Victor.
Yeah. Hi, thank you very much. It was very interesting discussion. I think question is first part of question: how to find a balance between this to link in empirical problem with theoretical question and theories, because we have this divide between more empirics and practitioner and scholars divide. Yeah. And I think in between there is a question that David was mentioning about every study is a case. In my opinion, it's a context-based theorizing, context-based reporting. So how to find balance between the theory and practice, and where is the place of context in your canvas? Because context factors are dispersed a little through all canvas. So thank you for commenting.
Davide, you want to take this? You mentioned.
I think that this may become clearer as we go through the other cells, because the selection of the setting and the discussion of the boundary conditions all recognize that there are contextual elements, especially in field research, whether it's qualitative or quantitative. And so if you don't mind, maybe it will be clearer in the next 20 to 30 minutes, and we can return to this question if it isn't. Okay.
Yes.
Marc and Davide, can I just add
Yes.
one very, very quick thing on this question. I think it's important to recognize that in all scientific fields, there is a difference between basic science and applied science, right? Like when you're studying proteins, you want to discover the protein. You don't worry about how it's going to be, leveraged to develop treatments or medications, right? And of course, there's always a tension, and especially in a field like management, which carries the name of a very applied discipline. But we need to understand where we fit in the spectrum, and some people see themselves as very much working on basic science, and some, and others will try to take that basic science and kind of translate it and help, use it to develop applications that are more kind of closer to what consultants or managers in the field are doing, right? But there's an entire spectrum. Depending on where people, stand. My take is that the top management journals are going to try to push work to be closer to what would qualify as basic science. Sort of very, as Davide said, what is this a case of? We need to figure out the big important question that we're answering. So that's
yes. Davide, you want to add to this?
No, I think it ties into the next section of the next cell of the campus, which is the theory, the theoretical constructs and relationships. Somebody asked in the chat, what is the difference between a theoretical puzzle and an empirical puzzle? And I think it goes back to what I was saying earlier. An empirical puzzle is a question about why something is happening or why something has happened or why some things seem to be related in very empirical setting specific terms. A theoretical question asks broader questions about why certain phenomena in general happen across multiple settings, why certain types of industries or organizations or occupations work in certain ways. And that is the difference, I think, between an empirical question that tries to understand a very specific setting and produces answers that are interesting for people that are specifically interested in that industry, that occupation, and questions that try to take what we observe in a specific setting and generalize it, bring it to a higher level of abstraction so that it can be interesting for a broader range of scholars, not just only those that are interested in that particular setting. When we talk about theory, we really talk about the set of ideas that aim to be tested or that emerge from your empirical study, depending on whether you have a quantitative or a qualitative approach to research. And by theoretical ideas, we refer to essentially constructs, to concepts that you use in order to provide an answer to your particular question. And these concepts can be perceptual constructs, can be properties of individuals, group organizations, can be strategies, practices, can be events, conditions, performance outcomes. Imagine of constructs as the elements of the framework that you're using in order to provide an answer to the question, whether this framework, whether you intend to test this set of ideas quantitatively or whether you derive this set of ideas qualitatively from your study. Now, when thinking about theory, and not everybody will agree with this, and some may think this as too restrictive, but I always found it useful to think to think of theory as composed by three elements. One element is the what, and the what are the building blocks, the concepts that I just mentioned, the building blocks that constitute your framework. The how is how these concepts are linked with one another, how they interrelate. Do they have causal relationships, sequential relationships, recursive? Do they co-evolve? Is the relation curvilinear or exponential? Like, depending on the type of model that you're developing, it's useful to specify how all these concepts are connected. And finally, the why, which is often forgotten, both in quantitative and qualitative papers we see at AMJ. People tell us, oh, we hypothesize this relationship between these two variables, but they don't clearly explain why do you think that is going to happen? Or people say, my model suggests that this process will evolve in this particular way. Okay, why do you think that's supposed to happen? So the articulation of the explanation of why you expect your construct to be interrelated the way they are, and by construct I refer also to phases of a process model, it's absolutely crucial. Because it really, the capacity to articulate a convincing, a compelling theoretical explanation for these interrelationships is what makes a difference between what could possibly be an accidental observation that is specific to your setting to a set of theoretical ideas that can be generalized, that can be transferred outside your setting because you're able to explain them in broader conceptual terms. And then the next question is, where do these ideas come from, or what reassures you that these ideas are a suitable answer to your question? And this brings us to the methodology part, which we divided in two sections. One is the research setting being the site, the context within which you decided to explore your question, whether quantitatively or quantitatively, the particular organization, industry, set of decisions, or experimental setting where you collected data and processed them in order to test or induce some set of theoretical ideas. And when describing a setting, it's absolutely important to clarify, why did you choose this setting? What makes you think that this particular industry, that this particular organization, or that this particular technology or occupation, or that this particular experimental arrangements are suitable to investigate your research question? What makes them an appropriate, if not an ideal, setting? Do they have some contextual information, contextual conditions? And then we go back to the previous question. Do they have some characteristics that may make them a little different from other similar settings, that they may somehow restrict or qualify your conclusions? It's important to start reflecting about this now, because, as Ned will tell you later, they will affect the transferability, the generalizability of your findings. In this sense, one of the issues that we often see, or relatively often see at the AMJ, is the selection of settings that are too particular. I think that at some point, people got kind of fed up of hearing or looking at studies of biotechnologies, law firms, and Hollywood, and said, okay, we need new settings. The problem is that then we saw a proliferation of settings that were so particular that it became unclear what can you possibly generalize based on that particular setting. So in this sense, if you have the temptation of saying, oh, my setting is unique perhaps, because, reflect on that, because if your setting is unique, what can we learn that can be transferred anywhere else? Your setting has to be somewhat different to make it interesting, but it still has to be part of a broader, it needs to let us investigate a broader phenomenon. Finally, methodology. I will not spend too much on this, because different methods, qualitative, quantitative, have different requirements. But what is important here is that you clarify and you have a very clear idea of what kind of data are you going to use to explore your question. How are you going to collect them? How are you going to process them? How is this data going to reassure you about the statements you make about your theoretical ideas? If you imply some causal relationships, how are you going to establish that there's a causal relationships between constructs? If you assume that, if you claim that a process unfolds in a certain way, how are you going to establish what drives the process forward, or is that anything has happened at all? If you want to understand how certain outcome is produced, how will you understand, how will you track this outcome, and how will you understand what really led to those outcomes, as opposed to things that just happen to happen at the same time? And I don't want to get any more specific than this, because this will bring us into very specific methodology. Last thing, please remember to keep in mind the mode of inference. Are you going to adopt a deductive approach, inductive, abductive, retroductive? You don't necessarily have to declare it, but I think it's important for you to clarify whether your theoretical ideas come first and inform your methodology, or your theoretical ideas are entirely produced by your study, or if they are going to be mobilized and modified, and then design your study accordingly. Because again, another problem we observe in AMJ papers is that people say, I'm going to be deductive or inductive, but then the way they treat theory and method is kind of inconsistent with their statements. But I would stop here and leave it open, perhaps, to some questions.
Thank you, Davide. Any particular questions to those three elements? Or Ned, you want to add something to it?
Just one quick thing. And one of the things that I learned in working on this with my colleagues that take other perspectives on organizational research, a qualitative perspective and a macro perspective, is I think as a micro researcher, we're sometimes guilty of shortchanging the research setting. But in these other ways of doing research, that's such an important consideration. And yet, in a lot of micro studies, it's here's my theory, and then we tested it with 400 people we recruited from Prolific, and that's it. And I think we could do better as micro scholars to explain a bit more why we've selected the particular setting that we have, and why aspects of that setting are particularly appropriate for testing our theory.
Okay. So, Alanut, you had a question.
Yeah. Hi, thank you very much. I have a question about the setting. Apart from choosing the setting, in studying and examining the setting, what approach do we actually choose to study the setting? Do we choose like what historians do, chronological approach to settings? How do we go about approaching the setting in our study? I'm a PhD student, so I'm just thinking about how do I approach the setting of my research. Does that make sense?
Maybe. Should I try?
Yes, please.
So, first of all, I think you have to establish whether the setting you have chosen is appropriate to investigate the theoretical question that you want to investigate. A problem with qualitative research is that often we choose the setting and the question is not quite clear. We like the setting, we are in love with the setting. I've been there myself several times. Okay, why is this setting interesting? What's going on here? What is the broader phenomenon that it will help you understand better? What is the more general theoretical question that this setting will help me address? And if this is not clear, the risk is that you end up with a very rich, deep understanding of a particular setting, but that's it. It will be then difficult for you to bring out some theoretical insights that will be more generalizable. Second thing then is, once you have established that this is an appropriate setting, then you should try to do as much as you can to familiarize with this setting, understand well what's going on there, and see if there are some specific contextual conditions, characteristics of this setting that may make it slightly different from comparable setting, so that you are able to understand whether your observations are influenced by this context, and then acknowledge this when you discuss your findings. We could go on for 45 minutes probably to talk about the setting and contextual conditions, but I hope this is already useful.
Thank you.
Thank you much for the question. I would suggest we move on to Ned with the final three elements, and then we take general questions afterwards, okay? So, Ned, I will share my screen again for you, and you can highlight the 3 blocks that you want to discuss.
Thank you. And I will move a little bit more quickly through these last 3 blocks to try to save some time for a general discussion. But these last 3 puzzle pieces will probably not click into place completely until after you've collected your data. So the rest of the puzzle canvas you should be able to fill out before you go collect data. Many of these other pieces you're going to actually not be able to fully answer until after you've conducted your study and the data come back. The one exception are the boundary conditions and limitations. As you're designing your study, you should maybe have a sense of what are the conditions under which this may or may not hold and what are the limitations of my design. But certainly the findings you're not going to know until after you do the study if you're doing your research in an ethical manner, which I'm sure you all are. Anyways, when we're talking about the findings, this is we've collected the data, we've analyzed it, and now we're looking to describe the patterns that we see in the data as they pertain to our predictions and our theory. And I will point out, if you look at our FTE on page 1167 and 1168, we have a larger table that has more questions about each of these puzzle pieces. So on the canvas itself, we have some of the key questions, but if you're curious about how you might go deeper, you could go to this table and then get some more thought-provoking questions about this particular puzzle piece. So for the findings, for example,
Shall I share it for you now? Shall I share it for you?
No, that's okay. I'll just
okay.
briefly describe. So for the empirical findings, if you were to go to that table, you would say, what empirical patterns do you see in your data? And then the questions are, what correlations, associations, co-occurrences, sequences, similarities, differences, consistencies, or other regularities do you observe empirically? What are the consistencies across or within studies, cases, or settings? How do you explain any inconsistencies? And then if you're doing quantitative research, how do you interpret your results in terms of both statistical significance and practical significance? So in other words, you could have a result that is significant at p is less than 0.05 and explains 0.001% of the variance in your phenomena of interest. And then you would have to articulate, well, why does that 0.001% matter? So in other words, how does your finding matter in practically for the problem? And I think an issue with the findings is it's important to be very clear and very descriptive about not only what you're finding, but tying that back to, if you're doing quantitative research, your predictions and your hypotheses. So hypothesis 1 predicted this. Here are the patterns that we observe in the data that are relevant to understanding whether or not that prediction that we made is supported. So that would be the results section of the paper. This empirical findings would translate to the results section of the paper. Next, we would move to the discussion section of the paper. And the first important piece of the discussion section would be the contributions. So normally in discussion sections, you summarize a little bit more. Here's what we did, here's what we found in 2 paragraphs. But then if you spend more time in the discussion session rehashing the findings, that's not great. You want to move fairly quickly, at least in AMJ, to a discussion of what those findings mean. How do these patterns advance the conversation that we mentioned earlier with the audience? How do they change how we think about our fundamental research puzzle? How do they help organizations? So even though we're a theoretical journal, we want it to be clear, this is why this advance in the scholarly conversation is also really important for organizations and the members of organizations. You know, how does it help leaders make decisions, or how does it help organizational strategy? So after talking about the contributions, it's also important to discuss transferability, as Davide said. What aspects of our context are perhaps unique and render our findings, idiosyncratic to this setting, versus which of our findings do we expect to be more robust and transferable to other settings? And then all research has limitations, and it's important to acknowledge those limitations. I think if you were to send a manuscript to AMJ with no limitations written, the reviewers would identify some very quickly. So it's important to get that conversation going initially and say, look, no research is perfect. Here are the things about our study that we're aware of that future research could build on. Whereas this is really a conversation we're contributing to. And rather than doing the perfect study, what we're looking for is just something that makes an important advance and opens up the door for more research in that area that other studies can then build on as well. So those would be the major things to think about. It's kind of after you have your data, what are the findings? What patterns did we notice? How does that contribute and advance knowledge relevant to our research question, the puzzle that our audience will care about, and then what are the boundary conditions and limitations that are the most salient of this research. So I'll pause there for questions pertaining to these three puzzle pieces, and then after that, we can open it up to a broader discussion.
Thank you very much, Ned, and let's stop the sharing for now. So, Guillaume, please.
Hello, thank you very much for the presentation. It's great to see you after, reading your names on lots of papers, etc. My question to Ned is regarding empirical findings. I was under the impression that in the results section of a paper, you put emphasis on describing what you found as neutrally as possible. So the results of the analysis. And then without necessarily answering the research question right away, you would emphasize answering the research question and contributions, as you said, in the discussion. So my question to you is, how do you balance trying to objectively or neutrally describe your results in the results section and sort of relating them to the research question? Thank you.
Yes, great question. And I'm going to answer from a micro perspective, and then I'll open it up to my colleagues, because I think this is an area where, for instance, qualitative scholars might have a different perspective. But I agree, you wouldn't want to spend much time in the results expounding on, well, here's what this means for my research question and how we advance theory. That would be a discussion section issue. What I do think it's important to do is to, as I mentioned, in a micro paper that's quantitative, be clear about which of your predictions the patterns that you're objectively describing relate to. So one of the things that can be really confusing for readers and reviewers of papers is when people start to describe the results of an analysis, but it's not clear what hypothesis those results are pertaining to. So the FTE series, which I saw mentioned in the chat from 2011, when it talks about reporting the results, also has some good guidance here. But what I typically do in a results section is I go hypothesis by hypothesis. Hypothesis one predicted leader vision communication. It was positively associated with follower engagement. The results of our regression analysis or whatever we did suggest this. Thus, hypothesis one was supported or not supported. Then you move to your next prediction. So you're not explicitly talking about the research question. You're more couching the results in terms of your hypotheses and predictions and what evidence you have there. Another thing that can be interesting is to potentially consider some supplemental analyses or robustness checks or things like that. But that would be the way that I would work that balance, is rather than worrying about the research question in the results, worry about the specific hypotheses or predictions that you made and organizing your presentation of the patterns according to those hypotheses in an orderly way. But I'll open that up to my colleagues as well, who might have other perspectives on it.
Davide, maybe you want to comment on from a qualitative perspective.
No, I think it's the same. Ideally, you have many ways of writing papers, but one way that clarifies, that makes it clearer for the audience to read, is to separate the findings, so what you observed, from a discussion, like the implications of what you observed for your research question, how we understand the phenomenon, future research, and so on and so forth.
Okay. Ash, you're next. Thank you.
I think Ned or David can answer this question because they both talked about the same thing. I found myself in the boundary conditions and limitations, especially on doing qualitative research, is like, okay, my setting is very, very specific. So does this mean my findings or my theorizing only applies to this setting? But then I can think of 10,000 limitations that, can apply to this setting. And when I extrapolate and I want to make this generalizable, so do I say, oh, this can fit to entrepreneurial decision making, or no, this can actually, revolutionize entrepreneurial cognition, or, where are these boundaries where, for a reviewer, how do I pace these limitations and set up for manageable future research?
I'll let Davide answer that in terms of qualitative research, and then I'll maybe chime in after.
So from your example, it seems that your problem is more about framing rather than contextual conditions. So you say, oh, is this study about entrepreneurial cognition, entrepreneurial decision-making? That is a matter of framing, of how you interpret your empirical observations in light of broader theoretical ideas. Is that correct?
To a certain extent, but you could say that decision making is part of cognition. So when do you extrapolate one level up, and when do you say, no, my boundary conditions is just on decision making, not the broader cognition?
I have an entire, almost an entire webinar in this series that talks about what is this a case of, that it's really about your, like, to what extent can you generalize from a very specific setting, and in what direction. So maybe you can have a look at that, and maybe that can be helpful.
And the only other thing I would add, I agree with that, as I think if you do a good job in the earlier portions of the paper explaining, here's this important theoretical idea that I have about this phenomena that's broadly relevant, and then here's why the particular setting that I've chosen is the best setting for testing this idea that I have about this broadly relevant phenomena, then when you get to the end, you have less to defend, right? Like, I mean, if you're kind of saying, here's this thing that like my main contribution is this idiosyncratic element of my context that I'm testing, that's probably not going to be as successful for AMJ papers. So what you want is to set the paper up so that people understand, no, here's this like broad, important, big theoretical contribution that I'm making, and here's why this aspect of my context is so important for testing it. Then I think you have a different conversation when you come to the discussion section. Whereas if you don't do as much of a job explaining the broad importance of the theoretical part up front, then people might say at the end, well, could that just be a feature of this? And it might not apply to that. So to some extent, I think you use the whole paper to address those issues.
We had a question in the chat by Michael about the theoretical conceptual papers. Would that canvas help those papers as well? Well, the canvas was designed for empirical management research, like we see for AMJ. That's a bit the idea of, that's the main focus. So what we do have is the AMR from the editor series, and I would encourage you to look at those from the editor series. They don't have a canvas like we have, but they have from the editor pieces that talk about conceptualizing this type of research and helping to carve out what are the boundary conditions perhaps for a theory, so that they can theorize about those. So I encourage you to look at this series. You just type in AMR from the editor's pieces, maybe in Google Scholar, and you will find this, or even I'll point it to the website. At AMJ, we have the from the editor series as well. You can type AMJ FTE and you will get all of those. For those attending live, I've put this in the chat together with the FTE that we discussed today and the canvas, and as well as the worksheet that asks more particular questions. Another question, Aldana? Aldana, you hear us? Yes.
Okay, can you hear
Now
me?
you hear, yes.
Okay, so I'm aware that this canvas is for one project, but what if you're doing 3 papers in PhD and you have 3 canvases and you're trying to, like, is there any recommendation to combine this 3 canvases into one project? How can we make sense of 3 different, maybe one qual into one big PhD?
You're looking for a meta canvas. No, but I think what you're referring to, like many PhD students will have exactly that question. So thank you for bringing it up. It's what I think this helps you to do is to really map out each of the project and see similarities and differences among them, and also regarding the approaches that we discuss here, because it's micro, macro, and qualitative research combined. What we're looking at here, I think it will help you to understand which question to ask where with which type of research method. So what what I think the benefit could be is it brings more transparency as you discuss it also with your supervisors, what you want to do in which paper and why the research question fits the different research methods. And I think that can be seen very nicely if you compare then your 3 papers or your 3 paper ideas. Any other Davide, Cincy, any other reaction to the meta canvas? No, they are excited for the next project that we have to do. It's a meta canvas that combines all 3.
I was
Elena,
just thinking
please.
it might be possible to use the canvas in a broader way. I would encourage you to experiment with seeing if you could use a single canvas to map a bigger project, like with 3 individual studies. Because I think it could probably help, for instance, with the dissertation, to think about your dissertation as here's the larger question I'm tackling, here's the audience that could be interested in it, and then instead of 1 study, here's 3 studies that I could do, or a theory paper and 2 studies. So we didn't necessarily design it with that in mind, but I'd encourage you to give it a try and let us know how it works out.
I think you just have to print a very, very, very large poster
Yeah,
to
that's
fit
right.
everything.
A huge one.
Elena, please.
Yes, hello. Thank you so much. And it was being very helpful. And I also appreciate the qualitative perspective. So I'm a qualitative scholar. And Mark, in the beginning, you briefly alluded to this onto-epistemological perspectives. So I would like if all of you or some of you can elaborate more, how does this canvas speak to pluralism and us coming from different paradigms? So for example, post-positivism and social constructionism, if we kind of see where some of the settings of things are not out there, but it's like co-constructed, co-created. I wonder how this canvas speaks to this point.
So I think that's a question for Davide, who is probably a webinar about this, correct?
Thank you. Thank you. Difficult stuff. All difficult questions always to me. I think this is a conversation that we had, and we did our best to be as general as possible and try to be as inclusive and all-encompassing as possible. But obviously, there were some limits to how nuanced we could be and how much we could unpack our considerations, given that we had 20 pages. So in the end, we had to simplify somewhat what was intended to be a more perhaps a broader and more encompassing treatment of the canvas. As probably Marc said in the beginning, and as I mentioned, like I can see that not every single epistemology, not every single research tradition can be fully represented and captured with this. There is a limit to what we can do if you try to offer something that cuts across various traditions. Possibly a next step might be to have a qualitative research canvas that then can somehow be, and vice versa, quantitative research canvas that can capture better the specificities of different traditions.
Okay. Johanna, please.
Thank you so much. So I have a practical question. I'm a PhD student and I'm researching in entrepreneurship. So I know like from the business model canvas, I really appreciate it. And my supervisor told me it's like great that you use the canvas, but don't forget to write something. So do you have like a tip that sometimes I get lost? I love all my post-it, but it gets fuller and fuller. And it's really hard to like get the jump to like the document, which should be linear. So can you give us some tips how to balance it and when to know when like maybe finish to add some post-its? Like I think it's a little bit hard for me at the moment.
Yeah, we call this in strategy, we call this paralysis by analysis. You have everything on this on your poster and then making the jump. So you have a lot of sympathy. But I can tell you what the trick is that works for me. I just start writing. you know, and then if I keep on writing, I have to confess, I'm not a quick writer, it takes forever, but you start writing, you are refining, and the canvas can help you to, I think once you mapped out the canvas, it's the clarity of thought that is improving, and I think that will help you in avoiding maybe too many drafts, you know, of your study. So, but definitely you have to make the jump, you know, start writing. So I think your supervisor is right. And the canvas, you know, I mentioned in the beginning, you can work on it with post-it notes, with pencil. So it is there as a living document, you know, and of course, with any type of research project that has an innovative touch and feel to it, you cannot know everything, you know, in advance. You know, you can, you know, maybe you discover a new literature that you need to look into, you know, while you work on this. Maybe you are, you know, thinking about a different research method that you're going to apply based on your research question, you know, which is all fine. So this is a living document, and part of the, I think, the learning as a PhD student is also to maybe err in some ways, and then figure out, well, that was not the perfect solution or the best solution, and then you go back. But I think that's a very valuable learning in itself, that you refine and then maybe discard some solutions, you know. So it's, in that sense, we didn't specify this actually in the FTE, but I think by applying it, by wrongly applying it and improving it and getting feedback, that's how we learn about our trade. That's what we, you know, how you learn your craft as a researcher. You know, I think there's no shortcut to that. So from that perspective, you know, make the jump. I would suggest make the jump, and even if the jump of writing like the first page, you're gonna revise that page over and over. That's what needs to be done. Any other ideas, Davide, Ned, Cinzi?
If I may kind of sort of underline some of what you said, Marc, I think it's really important to recognize that the first draft you put together should never be the final draft. And also, I mean, and that it changes so much. And I think the canvas is a tool to help refine it, right? To help define it at the beginning. So maybe you start with a canvas and you have your post-it notes, and then you're ready to start working on the first draft. And then you go back to the canvas and see, okay, given what I've done in this first draft, how can I use the canvas to improve it, and so on and so forth. And it's an iteration of on the project.
This is really helpful. Thank you so much.